She tried to trade her ring for food until the rancher said, "That isn't what we need. You are." In the frozen silence of a frontier town, a starving widow steps into the mercantile with nothing left but a gold band from her dead husband. The storekeeper laughs in her face until a weather-worn rancher stops her at the door. What he offers isn't pity, it's a chance at survival. But on the windswept plains, survival never comes easy. The railroad is carving its path through the valley, waving forged papers and burning barns to ashes. The marshal has already taken their silver. And the widow? She carries more than a ring. She carries the one thing that can turn his lonely ranch into a home worth fighting for. As storm clouds gather and the church bell tolls, can a widow with nothing left and a rancher on the edge of losing it all stand against a railroad empire and find a family in the ashes of winter? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more through the frosted windows of Dry Creek's mercantile. Weak January sunlight cast long shadows across worn floorboards. Rona Monroe's fingers trembled as she placed her husband's gold wedding ring on the counter, the simple band catching what little light filtered through. The weight of her children's presence behind her, Samuel shifting restlessly, little Eliza clutching his skirts pressed heavy on her heart. "Please," Rona said softly, her voice steady despite the shame burning in her chest. "We need beans, flour, and lamp oil. Just enough to get through the month." Mr. Jenkins, the storekeeper, picked up the ring between thumb and forefinger, his thin lips twisted in a sneer. His spectacles caught the gray morning light as he examined the band. "Can't eat gold, Mrs. Monroe. What good's a ring to me when half the county's behind on credit?" He dropped the ring back onto the scratched counter with a sharp ping. Samuel stepped forward, his young face flushing. "But sir—" "Hush now," Rona whispered, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. She could feel him trembling with indignation beneath her touch. At 10 years old, he carried himself like a man, trying so hard to fill his father's shoes. 7-year-old Eliza pressed closer to Rona's side, her small fingers tightening in the worn fabric of her mother's skirt. The child hadn't spoken a word since they'd entered the store, but Rona could feel her shivering. Their coats, patched and thin, did little against the bitter Colorado winter. "Come along, children," Rona said, scooping up the ring with as much dignity as she could muster. The metal felt cold against her palm, colder than the wind that had numbed her fingers on their walk into town. She turned toward the door, holding her head high even as her heart sank. The bell above the door chimed as they stepped onto the boardwalk. The morning air bit through their clothes, and Rona pulled both children close, trying to shield them from the wind. Fresh snow had begun to fall, thick flakes drifting down to join the drifts already piled against the buildings. "Ma'am?" The deep voice made Rona turn. A man stood a few feet away, his broad shoulders dusted with snow. Luke Harlow. She recognized him from church, though he rarely attended these days. Since losing his wife years back, he'd become something of a shadow in town, showing up only when necessary for supplies or business. "Mr. Harlow," she acknowledged, noting the kindness in his weathered face despite his reserved manner. Couldn't help but overhear. His voice was quiet, meant only for her ears. "Times are hard all around." Rona's cheeks burned, but she met his gaze. "We'll manage, sir. We always have." Luke studied her for a long moment, his eyes taking in Samuel's too thin jacket and Eliza's trembling form. "Got a proposition for you, Mrs. Monroe. My ranch needs tending, cooking, mending, keeping house. Been too long since there was a woman's touch about the place." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That ring you're holding, that isn't what we need." "You are." Rona's breath caught in her throat. She glanced down at her children, saw hope kindling in Samuel's eyes. The boy had been desperate for any chance to prove himself useful, to learn the ways of ranching and working the land. "It wouldn't be charity," Luke continued, as if reading her thoughts. Partnership's what I'm offering. Room and board for honest work. Your boy there's old enough to help with the stock. And the little one ... double quotes. His expression softened as he looked at Eliza. Well, place could use some music again. Been too quiet these past years. Eliza peeked up at him, her shy smile warming Rona's heart. The child did love her hymns, filling their tiny rented room with sweet melodies even on the darkest days. The wind gusted harder, carrying stinging pellets of snow. Rona pulled her children closer, weighing their options. Pride warred with practicality in her heart. They'd managed on their own since Thomas's passing, but winter was proving crueler than expected. The landlord's patience was wearing thin, and their food stores were almost gone. It's good land, Luke said softly. Plenty of room for growing things come spring. Warm barn for the stock, solid roof over the house. Could use some life in it again. Samuel looked up at his mother, hope shining in his eyes. Please, Ma? I could help with the horses. I'm strong enough. Rona touched the ring in her pocket, feeling its smooth surface. Thomas would have wanted them to survive, to thrive even. Keeping their dignity meant little if they froze or starved. You sure it wouldn't be an imposition? She asked quietly. Luke's face remained serious, but something in his eyes warmed. Wouldn't offer if I wasn't sure. Got the wagon just down the street. Could have you settled before the storm hits proper? As if to emphasize his words, the wind howled down the street, rattling the shop signs and driving the snow harder. Eliza shivered against Rona's side. Thank you, Mr. Harlow, Rona said finally. We accept your kind offer. The relief that crossed Luke's face was subtle but unmistakable. Much obliged, Mrs. Monroe. Let's get you folks home before this weather worsens. He led them to his wagon, helping them up onto the bench seat. As they settled in, Rona noticed the supplies already loaded in the back sacks of flour and beans. A tin of lamp oil, even a bolt of thick wool cloth. He'd already planned to help them, she realized. Whether they accepted his offer or not, the wagon creaked as Luke climbed up beside them, gathering the reins. He wrapped a heavy blanket around their shoulders, making sure Eliza was well covered before clucking to the horses. As they pulled away from the mercantile, Rona caught Mr. Jenkins watching through his window, his expression unreadable. The snow was falling faster now, but Luke handled the team with confident hands. Samuel sat forward, eagerly, watching every movement, while Eliza huddled close to her mother's side. Rona held them both, feeling the warmth of the blanket and the first stirrings of hope in her heart. Storms coming in from the north. Luke commented, his voice carrying over the creak of harness leather and the muffled thud of hooves in snow. But we'll make it home plenty quick. Got a good fire going in the hearth and soup warming on the stove. Figured you folks might appreciate a hot meal. Rona felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away before they could freeze. You're very thoughtful, Mr. Harlow. He nodded, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. Luke'll do just fine, ma'am. Reckon we ought to be less formal, seeing as we'll be sharing the same roof. Then you must call me Rona, she replied softly, watching as the town disappeared behind them, swallowed by the swirling snow. The wagon rolled on through the white landscape, carrying them toward a new beginning. Rona's hand found the ring in her pocket once more, but its cold weight seemed less heavy now. Sometimes, she realized, God's answers came in unexpected ways, not in gold or silver, but in the kindness of weather-worn hands and a heart that recognized need without judgment. The wagon creaked and swayed along the snow-covered trail, its wooden wheels finding frozen ruts beneath the fresh powder. Luke handled the reins with practiced ease, guiding his team steadily northward through the gathering storm. The afternoon light filtered weak and gray through the swirling snow, casting long shadows across the white landscape. Eliza had dozed off against her mother's side, wrapped snugly in the thick wool blanket Luke had provided. Her small face looked peaceful in sleep, dark lashes dusted with tiny snowflakes. Rona kept one arm protectively around her daughter while bracing against the wagon's movement with the other. Samuel, however, could hardly contain his excitement. He sat forward on the bench, eyes wide with wonder at everything around them. "Mr. Harlow, sir, how many cattle do you keep? Do they stay out all winter? How do they eat with all this snow?" Luke's weathered face softened slightly at the boy's enthusiasm. "About 50 head now," he answered, his voice carrying quietly over the crunch of snow beneath the wagon wheels. "Used to be more. Back when ... He paused, something distant crossing his expression. "Well, they're hardy stock. Know how to paw through snow for grass, and we put up enough hay to see them through the worst of winter. I can help with feeding them," Samuel offered eagerly. "I'm strong, and I learn quick. Reckon you'll get your chance, son." Luke nodded. "Ranch work's never done, especially in winter. Always need willing hands." Rona noticed how her son straightened at being called son, though Luke had surely meant it casually. It had been so long since Samuel had heard a man's voice speak to him with such simple respect. The wagon rolled on through the afternoon. Luke spoke sparingly, but answered Samuel's questions with patience, explaining about cattle breeds and winter feeding, about how to check for frozen water troughs and the importance of good shelter against the wind. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks barely visible through the snow: a lightning-struck tree, a distinctive rock formation, places that helped guide him home when the weather turned fierce. "Ranch was my father's before me," Luke shared during a quiet moment, his voice carrying an edge of memory. "Built it up from nothing, he did. Was thriving for years, especially after Sarah and I... He trailed off, hands tightening slightly on the reins. Been harder to keep up since she passed. 5 years now, come spring." "I'm sorry," Rona said softly, understanding the weight of such loss. "It must be difficult, managing alone." Luke nodded, his jaw working slightly before he spoke again. "Land's good, though. Rich grazing, strong spring that never fails. Just needs ... He glanced briefly at Rona and the children. "Well, it needs more than one pair of hands to make it what it could be." The short winter day was fading toward dusk when Luke finally announced, "Coming up on home now." Through the curtain of falling snow, Rona made out the dark shape of a substantial cabin, smoke rising straight and steady from its stone chimney. Beyond it stood a large barn and several outbuildings, their solid forms suggesting the ranch's former prosperity. As they drew closer, Rona could hear cattle lowing softly in the nearby pasture, their dark forms moving like shadows through the snow. The cabin itself was built of thick logs, its windows glowing with welcoming lamplight. A covered porch wrapped around two sides, stacked with split firewood and protected from the worst of the weather. Luke brought the wagon to a stop near the cabin's door. "Let me get you folks inside before I tend to the team," he said, helping them down from the bench. Samuel jumped down eagerly, while Rona carried a still drowsy Eliza. The cabin's interior was warm from a well-maintained fire, though Rona immediately noticed the sparse furnishings and general air of bachelor simplicity. The main room held a solid table with 4 chairs, a few rough-hewn benches, and a rocking chair that looked rarely used. The wooden floors were swept clean but needed a good scrubbing, and the windows could use a thorough washing. "Kitchen's through there," Luke said, gesturing to an adjoining room. "Bedroom at the back is yours and the children's. I keep to the loft upstairs." He paused, seeming almost apologetic. "It's plain, I know, but solid. No leaks, and the chimney draws well." Rona took in the simple hearth, the row of hooks holding cast iron pots, the shelves stocked with basic provisions. Everything was functional, but showed signs of neglect. Not from laziness, she could tell, but from a man too busy with outside work to properly tend to domestic matters. "It's a fine home." "Mr. Harlow, Luke?" she said sincerely. May I fix us some supper? You must be hungry after the long drive. Something like relief crossed Luke's face. Got beans and salt pork in the pantry. Fresh bread too, though it's a few days old. Help yourself to whatever you find. I'll see to the horses and be back shortly. While Luke worked outside, Rona set about preparing a simple meal. She found the kitchen adequately stocked, if somewhat disorganized. Samuel helped her locate dishes and utensils, while Eliza, now fully awake, sat at the table humming softly to herself as she watched the snow fall outside the window. The familiar work of cooking settled Rona's spirits. She seasoned the beans with care, warming them slowly and adding bits of salt pork. The bread, though slightly stale, would serve well enough for their first meal. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice all the small ways she could improve the space. A proper arrangement of cooking tools, curtains for the windows, perhaps some herbs dried and hanging from the rafters come summer. Luke returned just as she was setting bowls on the table, bringing a blast of cold air and the clean scent of snow with him. He stamped his boots and hung his coat by the door, then paused, seeming almost startled by the domestic scene before him. The cabin already felt different. Rona realized warmer somehow, and not just from the cooking fire. Smells good, he said quietly, taking his seat after the others were settled. Rona served everyone, making sure the children had full bowls. She noticed how Luke watched them eat, something soft and almost pained crossing his expression as Samuel wolfed down his portion and Eliza carefully sopped up every bit of broth with her bread. Been a while since anyone's had a proper appetite at this table, Luke commented, his voice rough with unspoken emotion. After the meal, while Luke added wood to the fire, Rona helped the children prepare for bed. The bedroom he'd given them was small but clean, with a sturdy bed and enough space for the pallets they'd brought for the children. She laid out their bedrolls, grateful for the warm quilts Luke had provided. When all was ready, Rona knelt beside her children, as she had every night since Thomas's passing. Samuel and Eliza pressed close on either side of her, their small hands clasped in prayer. "Dear Lord," Rona whispered, her voice steady despite the emotions of the day, "we thank you for your provision and protection. Thank you for bringing us to this place, for Mr. Harlow's kindness, for warm shelter from the storm. Give us strength for whatever lies ahead, and help us to be worthy of the trust placed in us. Watch over us this night." And ... double quote, she paused, then added softly, "Help us make this house a home again." "Amen," the children echoed, and Rona tucked them into their bedding, kissing each forehead in turn. From the main room came the quiet sounds of Luke banking the fire for the night. Through the window, snow continued to fall, but its threat seemed less menacing now. Rona touched Thomas's ring, which she still carried in her pocket, and felt a sense of peace settle over her. They weren't charity cases here. Luke had made that clear. They were partners in bringing life back to this lonely ranch, and perhaps, God willing, in healing each other's hearts as well. The January sun crept over the eastern hills, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Rona woke to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, their voices carrying clear through the crisp morning air. For a moment, she lay still, orienting herself in the unfamiliar bedroom. Samuel and Eliza slept soundly nearby, their breathing steady and peaceful. Careful not to wake her children, Rona slipped from beneath the warm quilts. The floorboards creaked softly under her feet as she made her way to the main room. The fire had burned low overnight, leaving only glowing embers. She added kindling and small logs with practiced hands, coaxing the flames back to life. In the kitchen, Rona found the makings for biscuits. Her fingers worked quickly, measuring flour and cutting in lard with sure movements. The familiar task brought comfort, a reminder that some skills remained constant no matter where life led. She hummed softly as she worked, an old hymn her mother had taught her. The scent of coffee and baking biscuits soon filled the cabin. Luke's boots sounded on the stairs from the loft, his tall frame appearing in the kitchen doorway. He paused, seeming surprised by the domestic scene before him. Didn't expect ... Well, he started, then cleared his throat. "Much obliged, Mrs. Monroe. Please, call me Rona," she replied, sliding a batch of golden biscuits from the oven. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some." Luke nodded, pouring himself a cup. "Gotta check the herd," he said after a moment. "Weather's fair enough today, but they'll need extra feed with this snow." The sound of small feet thundering down the hall announced Samuel's arrival. The boy's eyes lit up at the sight of Luke in his work clothes. "Can I help?" he asked eagerly. "I'm strong, and Pa taught me about cattle before he stopped." Swallowing hard, Luke studied the boy over his coffee cup. "Reckon an extra pair of hands wouldn't hurt," he said carefully. "If your ma agrees." Rona saw the hope blazing in her son's eyes. "Mind your manners and do exactly as Mr. Harlow says," she cautioned. Samuel nodded vigorously, already reaching for his coat as the males headed out. Eliza wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mama, where's Samuel?" "Helping Mr. Harlow with the cattle, dear heart." Rona set a warm biscuit before her daughter. "Would you like to help me today? This house could use some tending." The little girl brightened. "Can we sing while we work? Like we used to?" "Of course we can." Mother and daughter set about their tasks with determination. Rona found brooms and rags, and together they began sweeping away months of accumulated dust. They opened windows briefly to let in fresh air, despite the cold. Rona gathered what laundry she could find, noting mentally the items that needed mending. As they worked, their voices lifted in familiar songs. Eliza knew all her mother's favorites, their harmonies filling the cabin with life. They sang Amazing Grace while sweeping, Sweet By and By while washing windows, and What a Friend We Have in Jesus while hanging laundry on the indoor drying lines. Rona had strung across the back room. The day passed quickly. By late afternoon, the cabin felt noticeably different. Floors gleamed, windows sparkled, and the air held the fresh scent of soap and pine. Even the furniture seemed to sit straighter, as if glad for the attention. Samuel burst through the door as evening approached, his cheeks red with cold and excitement. "Ma, Mr. Harlow showed me how to break ice in the troughs, and I helped carry hay to the cattle, and he said I did a good job." Rona smiled at her son's enthusiasm. "Did you thank Mr. Harlow for teaching you?" "Yes'm," Samuel nodded. "He says I can help again tomorrow." Luke entered more slowly, stamping snow from his boots. His eyes moved around the cabin, taking in the changes. "Place hasn't looked this bright since ... He trailed off, but his expression spoke volumes. Over supper, Luke seemed more talkative than he had been the previous day. "Been hard winters lately," he admitted, breaking a biscuit. "Drought last summer meant less hay put up. Cattle prices down at market. Times when I wondered if I could hold on to the place." Rona listened thoughtfully. "We knew lean times after Thomas passed," she offered. "I learned some ways to stretch what we had. Mending instead of buying new, preserving every bit of food we could, finding uses for things others might throw away." "That so?" Luke looked interested. Sarah was good at such things, but since she's been gone ... He shook his head. Then focused on keeping the cattle alive, letting other things slide. "Perhaps we could help with that," Rona suggested. "I'm handy with a needle, and come spring, we could plant a proper garden. Root cellars keep vegetables well through winter." Luke nodded slowly, considering her words. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Luke rose, hand moving instinctively toward his rifle before recognizing the rider through the window. "Evening, Tom," he called as he opened the door to a snow-dusted neighbor. "What brings you out in this weather?" The man's face was grave. "Thought you ought to know, Luke. Railroad surveyor's been spotted near Dry Creek, marking lines across Jacobson's south pasture. Word is they're planning a route straight through to Denver. Rona saw the change come over Luke's face, a darkening of his expression, a tightening of his jaw. His hands gripped the back of his chair until the knuckles went white. "How many?" he asked tersely. "3 men with their instruments. More behind them, I'd warrant. You know how these things go." Tom glanced at Rona and the children, then back to Luke. "Thought you should be warned, seeing as your water rights ... Luke nodded sharply. "Much obliged for riding out, Tom. Keep me informed if you hear more." After the neighbor departed, Luke stood at the window for a long moment, staring out into the gathering dusk. Rona watched him, sensing the weight of worry settling over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Samuel and Eliza picked up on the tension, growing quiet over their plates. "Bad news?" Rona finally asked softly. Luke turned, his face troubled. "Could be. Railroad's been buying up land all through the territory. Those that won't sell find themselves facing trouble, mysterious fires, cut fences, cattle scattered. They want this route bad enough to take what they need. But it's your land," Samuel protested. "They can't just take it." "Wish it were that simple, son." Luke ran a hand through his hair. "Railroads got money and lawyers. Got the government backing them too. Calling it progress." He looked at Rona. "I'm sorry. You came here seeking shelter, and now ... We came seeking partnership," Rona corrected gently. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Luke held her gaze for a long moment, something like gratitude flickering in his eyes. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows. But inside, despite the shadow of this new threat, the cabin remained warm with the day's efforts, the clean floors, the fresh bread, the lingering echoes of songs, and the sense of 4 people beginning to form something like family. Dawn brought another clear morning, the sun glinting off fresh snow. Luke stood at his barn door, checking the harness on his wagon team, while Samuel practically bounced with excitement beside him. "You sure you want to come to town, boy?" Luke asked, though he already knew the answer. "It's mighty cold on that wagon seat." "Yes, sir." Samuel's breath came out in eager puffs of steam. "I can help carry supplies and everything." Inside the cabin, Rona wrapped an extra scarf around her son's neck. "Mind your manners in town," she reminded him. "And stay close to Mr. Harlow. He'll be fine," Luke assured her, his voice gentle. "We'll be back before dark." Eliza clung to her mother's skirts, watching her brother climb up onto the wagon seat. Rona squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "Let's wave them off. Then we'll see about making those quilts I promised Mr. Harlow." The wagon creaked as it pulled away, Samuel's excited wave visible until they disappeared around the bend. Rona guided Eliza back inside, where the day's tasks awaited. The trip to town took nearly 2 hours through the snow-packed roads. Samuel peppered Luke with questions about ranching, cattle, and the approaching winter. Luke found himself answering more freely than usual, the boy's enthusiasm wearing away at his customary silence. "How many cattle you got, Mr. Harlow?" "About 200 head," Luke replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "Used to be more, before the drought. Pa had 10 cows, Samuel offered. But they got sick, and then he got sick too. Double quotes. His voice trailed off. Luke glanced at the boy, noting the shadow that crossed his young face. "Your pa teach you much about ranching?" "Some. He showed me how to milk and feed them. Said I'd learn more when I got bigger." Samuel straightened his shoulders. "I'm bigger now." They reached Dry Creek just before noon. The street was relatively quiet, with only a few townspeople hurrying between buildings in the cold. Luke tied the wagon outside the mercantile, helping Samuel down. "Now," he said quietly, "let me do the talking in here." The bell above the door jangled as they entered. The storekeeper, Mr. Peters, looked up from his ledger, his expression souring when he recognized Samuel. Then he saw Luke behind the boy, and something like uncertainty crossed his face. "Harlow," he said stiffly, "what can I do for you?" Luke stepped forward, his presence filling the small space. "Need supplies. Flour, coffee, sugar. Some yard goods, too." His voice was calm but carried an edge. "Seems you turned away customers yesterday who needed the same." The storekeeper's face reddened. "That woman tried to pay with jewelry." "This ain't a pawn shop. That woman," Luke said deliberately, "is keeping house for me now. Her and her children are under my protection. I expect them to be treated with respect when they come to town." He placed several coins on the counter. "Now, about those supplies." Peter swallowed, his eyes darting between the money and Luke's steady gaze. "Yes, sir." Right away, Samuel helped gather the items as Peter scurried around, pulling goods from shelves. Luke added extra coffee and sugar, some peppermint sticks, and several yards of warm fabric that caught his eye. Everything was loaded into the wagon. Peter's now almost painfully polite in his assistant's thought as they prepared to leave town. Luke spotted a group of men near the edge of Main Street. They wore city clothes despite the weather, and one held surveying equipment. The man in front, clearly in charge, wore a fine coat and hat that marked him as an Easterner. "Wait here," Luke told Samuel, stepping down from the wagon. He approached the group, his boots crunching in the snow. The well-dressed man turned, revealing a clean-shaved face and calculating eyes. "Ah, you must be local. I'm James Sloan, Denver and Pacific Railroad." He extended his hand, which Luke didn't take. "Luke Harlow. That's my ranch you're heading toward." "Excellent. Saves us having to track you down." Sloan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're surveying the new line through to Denver. Progress is coming to this valley, Mr. Harlow, whether folks are ready or not. My land's not for sale," Luke said flatly. Sloan's smile tightened. "Everything's for sale at the right price. But that's not really the point. The railroad's been granted right-of-way by the territorial government. We're bringing civilization, Mr. Harlow. Commerce. Future. You're bringing trouble," Luke corrected. "And you'll find plenty of it if you try crossing my land. Careful now." Sloan's voice hardened. "Smarter men than you have tried standing in the way of progress. They learn better, one way or another." He glanced meaningfully at Luke's wagon, where Samuel waited. "Shame if anything happened to your ... family." Luke stepped closer, his shadow falling across the railroad man. "That sounds like a threat. Just an observation about how things tend to go." Sloan stepped back, adjusting his coat. "We'll be seeing you soon, Mr. Harlow. Think about what's best for everyone." Luke watched them walk away, his jaw tight. When he returned to the wagon, Samuel looked worried. "Are they bad men, Mr. Harlow?" "Just men who want something that ain't theirs," Luke replied, taking up the reins. "Best get home before your ma worries." The return journey was quieter, both lost in thought. The sun was low when they finally pulled up to the cabin. Warm light spilled from the windows, and the smell of cooking greeted them as they opened the door. Rona and Eliza had been busy. The main room was transformed by 2 new quilts hanging over the backs of chairs, their patterns simple but cheerful. A pot of stew bubbled on the stove, and fresh bread cooled on the table. "Welcome home," Eliza called, running to hug her brother. "Mama and I made quilts." "So I see," Luke said, his eyes taking in the changes. Something in his chest tightened at the word home from the little girl's lips. Over supper, Luke shared the day's events, his voice growing grim when he described the encounter with Sloan. "Railroads getting bold," he concluded. "They've been buying up land all through the territory, but this is different. They're not even pretending to negotiate anymore." Rona listened carefully, her hand unconsciously reaching for Eliza's. "What can they actually do? Legally? They claim they have government backing. Illegally?" Luke shook his head. "I've heard stories. Cattle scattered, fences cut, fires in the night. They wear folks down until selling seems the only choice. But we won't sell, will we? Samuel asked anxiously. This is our home now. Luke looked at the boy, then at Rona. I'm sorry. You came here for shelter, not to get caught in my fight. We came here to build something together, Rona said quietly. Whatever comes, we face it as a family. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Rona knelt beside her bed. The moonlight through her window cast silver patterns on the quilt she and Eliza had made that day. Lord, she whispered, grant us courage for whatever lies ahead. Help me be strong for my children and for Luke, who's opened his home to us. Show us the path through this valley of shadows. She touched the quilt, fingers tracing the simple pattern of squares and triangles. Like the pieces of their lives, she thought, being stitched together into something new, something worth fighting for. The day settled into a comfortable rhythm at the Hollow Ranch. Each morning, Luke and Samuel headed out at first light to check the cattle, their breaths visible in the crisp winter air. Samuel learned quickly, proud to help with feeding and basic ranch work. Luke found himself speaking more, explaining the ways of cattle and land to the eager boy. Inside the cabin, Rona and Eliza worked steadily. The little girl hummed hymns while helping her mother knead bread dough or sort through Luke's collection of clothes that needed mending. Under Rona's careful hands, shirts gained new buttons, socks found their holes closed, and warm patches disappeared from trousers. Mama, Eliza asked one morning, watching her mother's needle flash in the sunlight, does Mr. Luke like having us here? Rona paused in her sewing. I believe he does, sweetheart. Why do you ask? He smiled yesterday when Samuel told that funny story about the calf. I never saw him smile before. Rona nodded, remembering that moment at supper. Luke's face had softened, years seeming to fall away as he laughed at Samuel's animated tale. When Sunday arrived, Luke surprised them all. Best get ready for church, he announced over breakfast. Pastor Jennings will be preaching today. Church? Samuel looked up from his porridge. We ain't been since ... Since Pa. Eliza finished quietly. Rona touched her daughter's shoulder. That's kind of you, Luke, but perhaps we should stay here. People talk, and I wouldn't want to cause any gossip that might reflect poorly on you. Luke's jaw set firmly. Let them talk. You're under my protection now, and that means taking my family to church. The word family hung in the air, warming the room more than the morning sun. Rona felt her eyes sting with grateful tears as she hurried to get the children ready. The wagon ride to town was cold but peaceful. Luke had found extra blankets for them all, and Eliza snuggled between her mother and brother, singing softly. The small white church came into view, its steeple reaching toward the winter sky. Other wagons and riders were already gathering, and heads turned as Luke helped Rona and the children down. Whispers followed them into the sanctuary. Rona heard fragments. Widow Monroe, and living at Harlow's, and what would Martha think? She held her head high, guiding her children to a pew near the middle. Luke sat beside them, his presence solid and reassuring. Pastor Jennings stood to preach, his kind eyes sweeping over the congregation. His sermon spoke of mercy, of how God's love shows itself through community and caring hearts. When we lift each other's burdens, he said, we fulfill Christ's law. When we welcome the stranger, we welcome angels unaware. Rona felt the words settle into her soul like healing balm. Beside her, Luke sat straighter, as if the message spoke directly to his decision to take them in. After the service, the congregation moved to the church hall for the community supper. Tables groaned with dishes brought by each family. Roasted chickens, fresh bread, pies, and preserves. Rona had contributed a batch of her mother's honey biscuits, worried they weren't enough. But she saw them disappearing quickly. Those biscuits are a blessing, Mrs. Thompson, the blacksmith's wife, declared. Luke Harlow's table must be mighty fine these days. It is, Samuel piped up proudly. Mama makes the best food, and she fixed all our clothes, too." Other women gathered around, their initial reserve melting as they spoke with Rona about recipes and household matters. She found herself drawn into conversations about preserving fruit and the best way to patch quilts. It felt wonderfully normal, like belonging. Across the room, Luke stood with other ranchers, discussing cattle prices and winter feed. But his eyes often strayed to where Rona sat with the women, noting how she smiled more freely than he'd ever seen. Eliza had found other children her age, playing a clapping game in the corner. Her sweet laugh carried across the room, making Luke's heart lift. He remembered other Sundays when his house had been full of such sounds, before Martha's passing left everything too quiet. "Your place is coming alive again, Luke," George Thompson commented, following his gaze. "Good to see smoke in that chimney, hear children's voices." Martha would have wanted that. Luke nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. But not all conversations were so gentle. Near the door, several men gathered around James Sloan, the railroad foreman who had appeared late in the afternoon. "Progress is inevitable," Sloan was saying smoothly. "The railroad means more trade, better prices for cattle, real prosperity for Dry Creek. Why should we let a few stubborn ranchers hold back the future? Arlo's land has been in his family 3 generations, someone argued. And what's that worth compared to bringing civilization to the territory?" Sloan countered. "Besides, the government's already granted us right of way. Smart folks will take our offers while they're still generous." The debate spread through the hall like ripples in a pond. Some nodded eagerly at Sloan's promises of prosperity, while others frowned, remembering similar promises that had turned sour in other towns. Pastor Jennings moved through the crowd, his presence calming heated words. "Let's remember, we're here to break bread together," he reminded gently. "Neighbor with neighbor, as God intended." The evening wound down as the winter sun set early. Families began gathering children and empty dishes, heading home before the cold deepened. Luke helped Rona and the children into the wagon, tucking blankets around them carefully dotted as they rode home under the rising moon. Eliza dozed against her mother's shoulder. Samuel pointed out stars appearing one by one, naming the constellations Luke had taught him that week. Rona watched the boy's animated gestures, seeing how naturally he and Luke had grown close. Her heart felt full, remembering the warmth of welcome she'd found among the churchwomen, the way Luke had proudly introduced them as his family. "Thank you," she said softly to Luke, "for insisting we go today. It meant more than I can say." Luke's hands were steady on the reins. "A family should be in church together," he replied simply. "And you gave those folks something to think about besides railroad talk. Do you really think they'll try to take your land?" "They'll try," Luke said. "But we're stronger together than alone." That's what today showed me. The wagon rolled on through the darkness, carrying them home to the ranch where a lamplight waited in the windows. Together, Rona thought, they were building something worth protecting, something that even the railroad's money couldn't buy. In the lamplight of the cabin, she helped sleepy children prepare for bed. Their prayers that night were full of gratitude for new friends, for belonging, for the chance to be a family again. Yet as she tucked them in, Rona couldn't help wondering how long this peace would last, with the railroad's shadow stretching across their future. The crisp morning air carried a hint of trouble as Luke rode toward town, his breath forming clouds in the winter sunlight. A messenger had arrived at dawn with an official summons from Marshal Thompson, ordering Luke to appear at the courthouse by 10 o'clock. "I reckon I'd better see what this is about," Luke had told Rona over breakfast, trying to keep his voice steady for the children's sake. But worry had creased her brow as she handed him a wrapped biscuit for the ride. "We'll pray for you," she'd said softly, and young Samuel had offered to come along. Luke declined, knowing in his gut this wasn't a meeting for children. Now, as he hitched his horse outside the weathered courthouse, Luke noticed several expensive carriages bearing the railroad company's mark. His stomach tightened. Inside, the small courtroom already held a gathering of men. Marshal Thompson at his desk, looking uncomfortable despite his attempt at official dignity, and 3 railroad men in fine suits, including the foreman he'd confronted before. "Mr. Harlow," Marshal Thompson said, his voice carrying a forced authority. "Thank you for responding to the summons. The railroad company has brought forward some documents requiring our immediate attention." The railroad foreman, Sloan, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Harlow, we're simply here to clarify a matter of record." He produced a yellow document from his leather case. "This easement agreement, signed by yourself 3 years ago, grants the railroad right-of-way across the northern section of your property." Luke's jaw clenched. "That's a lie. I never signed any such thing. Your signature suggests otherwise." Sloan passed the paper to Marshal Thompson, who made a show of examining it. Luke stepped closer, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The signature looked remarkably like his own, but he knew with absolute certainty he'd never signed away any part of his land. "That paper is a forgery, Marshal, and you know it." Marshal Thompson shifted in his chair, not meeting Luke's eyes. "The document appears legitimate to me, Mr. Harlow. Properly witnessed and notarized." "By whom?" Luke demanded. "What notary?" "By Jefferson Mills, who sadly passed away last spring," Sloan interjected smoothly. "But his seal is quite clear." Luke's hands curled into fists. Jefferson Mills had indeed been the town's notary, but he'd been bedridden with consumption 3 years ago, barely able to hold a pen. These men had chosen their false witness carefully. A dead man could neither confirm nor deny their claims. "This is theft dressed up in legal papers," Luke said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're trying to steal land that's been in my family for 3 generations. Now, Mr. Harlow," Marshal Thompson said, "let's keep things civil. The railroad has legitimate business interests." "Legitimate?" Luke's voice rose. "There's nothing legitimate about forged documents and bought justice." The marshal's face reddened. "That's enough. I'm declaring this matter settled in favor of the railroad company. Their easement rights are valid and legally binding." Luke saw Sloan slip something into the marshal's desk drawer, a fat envelope that probably explained the lawman's sudden certainty. The sight of such blatant corruption made his blood boil. "You'll regret this," Luke said, his words carrying the weight of truth rather than threat. "Both of you." He turned and strode out, letting the courthouse door slam behind him. The ride home seemed longer than usual, each hoofbeat matching the pounding in his temples. The land he passed, his land, his father's land, his grandfather's land, had been won through years of honest work and sacrifice. Now it was being stolen by men who wielded paper and lies as their weapons. Sun was setting by the time he reached the ranch. Through the cabin window, he could see Rona teaching Eliza to knead bread while Samuel set the table. The simple domestic scene nearly broke him. This family that had brought life back to his home might have to watch it all be destroyed. Rona met him at the door, reading the defeat in his posture. "The children have been watching for you since afternoon," she said gently. "Come in where it's warm." Inside, the familiar smells of baking bread and beef stew wrapped around him. But even these comforts couldn't ease the bitterness in his heart. He slumped into a chair by the fire, running a hand over his face. "Uncle Luke," Eliza called out, the name falling naturally from her lips for the first time. She hurried over with flour-dusted hands. "We made special bread today. Did you have a hard day?" The innocent question and the new name, Uncle Luke, caught him off guard. His throat tightened as Samuel joined them, looking concerned. "Yes, little one," he managed. "A very hard day." After the children were served their supper and sent to wash up, Luke told Rona everything. The forged document, the corrupt marshal, The railroad's victory through deceit. They'll start laying track across our north pasture come spring, he said, his voice heavy with despair. And there's nothing I can do to stop them. No justice to be found in that courthouse. Rona was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. There's a higher justice than man's, she said finally. God sees what's true, even when human laws fail us. God's justice won't stop their railroad, Luke replied bitterly. Perhaps not, she agreed. But it gives us strength to face whatever comes. And you're not facing it alone anymore. As if to prove her words, Samuel and Eliza returned, sensing the heavy mood in the room. Without a word, Eliza climbed into Luke's lap, while Samuel stood beside his chair, one small hand on his shoulder. Are you sad, Uncle Luke? Eliza asked softly. The simple question and the trust in her eyes cracked something in Luke's heart. Yes, honey. Some bad men are trying to take part of our land, but they can't. Samuel protested. It's ours. We'll fight them. Luke managed a weak smile at the boy's fierce loyalty. Sometimes fighting isn't enough, son. Sometimes the bad men have too much power. Then we'll pray, Eliza said with complete conviction. Mama says God is bigger than any bad men. Rona rose and came to stand behind Luke's chair, her hand joining her son's on his shoulder. She's right. We'll pray, and we'll face this together as a family. Luke closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of their touch, their presence, their faith. The railroad might have won today's battle through corruption and lies, but they couldn't take this, the love and trust of these three souls who had become his family. In their faith, he found a glimmer of strength, a spark of hope that even the darkest injustice couldn't extinguish. Thank you, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. All of you. Eliza hugged him tighter, and Samuel pressed closer to his side. Together they sat in the firelight, a family united against the gathering storm, their prayers rising silently in the peaceful evening air. The January sky darkened early, heavy clouds rolling in from the west like a gray wool blanket. Luke stood at the barn door, studying the threatening horizon with practiced eyes. The air held that peculiar stillness that often preceded a big storm, and the cattle huddled close together in the pasture, their breath forming clouds in the cold air dot inside the cabin. Rona noticed the changing light through the window as she kneaded dough for the evening bread. Something's coming, she murmured, more to herself than to Eliza, who sat nearby stringing dried beans. The first flakes began to fall, just as Luke and Samuel hurried in from the barn, carrying armloads of extra firewood. Storm's moving in fast, Luke announced, stamping snow from his boots. Might be a bad one. Rona immediately set to work, filling every available pot and bucket with fresh water from the pump. Samuel helped Luke stack the firewood while Eliza gathered extra blankets. They'd barely finished their preparations when the wind picked up, whistling through every crack in the cabin's walls. The blizzard struck with full force just after sundown. Wind howled around the corners of the house like a wild thing, rattling the windows in their frames. Snow drove sideways past the glass, thick and blinding. Luke added logs to the fire, building it higher against the deepening cold. Sounds angry out there, Samuel said, pressing his face to the window until Rona gently pulled him back. Best not get too close to the glass, dear. It's gotten mighty cold. She moved to the cook stove, where a pot of stew simmered. Their supplies were growing lean. She'd stretched, the last of the beef with extra potatoes and carrots, but the rich smell still filled the cabin with comfort. Eliza huddled closer to the fire, clutching her worn rag doll. I'm scared, Mama. No need to be frightened, little one, Luke said, his voice gentler than Rona had ever heard it. This old cabin's weathered plenty of storms. We're safe in here. The wind's fury increased as night deepened. Luke lit both oil lamps, their golden light pushing back the darkness. The storm's voice seemed to fill the whole world, making their shelter feel smaller, more intimate. They gathered close to the hearth after supper, sharing its warmth. "Shall we have a song?" Rona suggested, noting the tension in her children's faces. Without waiting for an answer, she began to sing, her clear voice rising above the storm. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Double quotes. Eliza joined in immediately, her small voice matching her mother's familiar melody. After a moment, Samuel added his boyish tenor. Luke remained silent, but Rona could feel him listening intently from his chair by the fire. They sang through their favorite hymns. "Rock of Ages, what a friend we have in Jesus. Sweet hour of prayer." The storm raged on, but inside their circle of lamplight, peace descended. Rona's voice carried strength and comfort, steady as a heartbeat. Luke watched her as she sang, her face soft in the golden light. Something stirred in his chest, an ache he'd almost forgotten how to feel. It had been so long since music had filled these walls. His Emma had loved to sing too, before the fever took her. He'd thought that part of his life was over forever. But now the children eventually dozed off. Samuel leaning against Luke's knee, Eliza curled in her mother's lap. Still, Rona hummed quietly, her fingers stroking her daughter's hair. "Been a long time since I heard such sweetness in this house," Luke said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Rona's humming faded. She met his eyes across the firelit space between them, and something unspoken passed between them, warm and tender as a touch. The blizzard raged for 2 days before finally blowing itself out. When Luke opened the cabin door on the third morning, the world had been transformed into a dazzling white expanse. The sun sparkled on untouched snow that had drifted higher than the fence posts. "We'd best check the cattle," he told Samuel over breakfast. The boy's eyes lit up at the prospect of helping. Despite the brutal cold waiting outside, they bundled up in every layer they could manage. Rona wrapped an extra scarf around Samuel's neck and pressed a pair of spare wool socks into Luke's hands. "Be careful out there," she said softly, her concern evident in her eyes. The trouble was exactly where Luke had feared it might be. A section of fencing along the north pasture had given way under the weight of drifted snow, and several cattle had already wandered through the gap. He and Samuel spent hours struggling through knee-deep snow, driving the strays back toward the herd while their breath frosted in the bitter air. "My fingers are frozen solid," Samuel complained as they worked to repair the fence, but he didn't stop helping. Luke showed him how to splice the broken wire, proud of the boy's determination despite the cold. Just past noon, they heard the crunch of approaching footsteps in the snow. Rona and Eliza appeared, carrying a large basket between them. Steam rose from beneath the cloth covering. "We thought you might need something warm," Rona called out, her cheeks pink from the cold. She pulled back the cloth to reveal a pot of hot beef soup and fresh biscuits. Luke couldn't remember the last time anyone had thought to bring him hot food while he worked. He and Samuel sat on a fallen log, warming their hands around tin cups of soup, while Eliza chattered about watching the snowfall. The simple meal in the crystal-bright winter day felt like a feast. That evening, after the children were asleep, Luke and Rona sat alone by the fire. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional pop of burning wood and the children's soft breathing from the loft above. "Thank you," Luke said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "For the soup today, for the singing during the storm, for ... He gestured vaguely, struggling to find words for all she brought back into his life. "You don't need to thank me," Rona replied softly. "You've given us so much more, a home, safety, purpose." Still, Luke stared into the flames. "I hadn't heard such warmth in years. Hadn't realized how much I missed it until ... double quote." He trailed off, glancing at her. Rona felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. She looked down at her hands, aware of how close they sat, how private this moment felt. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as necessity, she said finally. When we first met at the mercantile, I thought I was merely accepting charity to survive the winter. I never imagined ... She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. They both felt it, this growing warmth between them, this sense of rightness that had nothing to do with mere convenience or practicality. Something deeper was taking root, as natural and unstoppable as spring following winter. Luke reached over and gently covered her hand with his. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn low, while outside the stars wheeled bright and cold above the snow-covered ranch. The sunset painted the western sky in shades of crimson and gold as Luke's wagon approached the ranch. He'd spent the afternoon in town, arranging for spring supplies and checking on railroad movements. The air held the sharp bite of late winter, but hints of thaw whispered through the evening breeze. His thoughts wandered to the warm supper waiting at home, to Rona's welcoming smile and the children's eager chatter. The peaceful reverie shattered as he crested the final rise. Orange flames licked the darkening sky, and thick black smoke billowed from his barn. The structure that had stood for 3 generations was being devoured by fire. Dear God, no! Luke snapped the reins, urging the horses faster. The wagon bounced violently over the rutted road as his heart thundered in his chest. As he drew closer, he could see Rona and the children already outside, safe but terrified. Samuel clutched his sister's hand while Rona tried to calm their frightened sobs. The crackling roar of the flames filled the air, along with the panicked lowing of cattle in the nearby pasture. Luke leaped from the wagon before it fully stopped. "Are you all right?" he demanded, quickly checking them over. "We're unharmed," Rona assured him, her face pale in the firelight. "We smelled smoke and got out right away. I've sent Samuel's pony to alert the neighbors." Luke turned to face the inferno. The barn's wooden walls were fully engulfed now, timbers groaning as they succumbed to the flames. Inside was the winter feed for his entire herd, hay and grain that had taken months to gather and store. Without it, the cattle wouldn't survive until spring grass. This was no accident, he growled, fists clenching at his sides. The railroad men, they must have ... The thunder of approaching hooves interrupted him as the first neighbors arrived. The McKinnons from the next ranch over came galloping in, followed closely by the Petersons and old Jim Tucker. More riders appeared on the ridge, drawing near at full speed. "Form a bucket line," shouted Tom McKinnon, already jumping down from his horse. "Get water from the creek." People scrambled to help, passing buckets hand to hand from the creek to the burning barn. But the fire had too much of a head start. Despite their desperate efforts, the flames continued to climb higher, consuming everything in their path. Luke worked alongside his neighbors, throwing bucket after bucket of water at the blaze until his arms ached. But as the roof began to cave in with a tremendous crash of burning timber, he knew it was hopeless. Years of careful planning and hard work were turning to ash before his eyes. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees in the trampled snow. The weight of loss pressed down on him like a physical thing, threatening to crush his spirit entirely. Without feed for the cattle, everything he'd built, everything he'd hoped to pass on to Samuel someday, would be lost. "I'll kill them," he whispered, then louder. "I'll kill them for this." He staggered to his feet and started toward the house where his rifle waited. "Luke, no." Rona caught his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please don't do this." He tried to shake her off, grief and rage burning in his chest. "They've destroyed everything. They think they can drive me off my land with their threats and their fire. I'll show them. Violence will only destroy what's left." Rona's voice cracked with emotion, but she didn't let go. "Think of Samuel watching you ride out for revenge. Think of what that would teach him. They have to pay for this. Luke's voice was raw with pain. And they will, Rhoda insisted, tears streaming down her face. But not through bloodshed. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Please, Luke, don't let them turn you into a murderer. She pulled him closer, pressing her tear-stained face against his chest. Remember what the good book says. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. It takes more courage to show mercy than to seek revenge. Luke stood rigid in her embrace, trembling with the force of his conflicting emotions. Samuel and Eliza crept closer, their young faces reflecting fear, not of the fire, but of seeing their strong, steady Uncle Luke so close to breaking. Papa wouldn't want you to kill anyone, Samuel said quietly, his voice small but determined. He always said violence just makes more violence. Something in Luke's chest cracked at the boy's words. The rage drained away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. His arms came up to hold Rhoda, and he buried his face in her hair, letting out a shuddering breath. The neighbors worked through the night, containing the fire and preventing it from spreading to the house or other structures. By dawn, the barn was nothing but smoking ruins. The winter feed was completely destroyed, along with tools, tack, and equipment collected over years. Luke stood in the gray morning light, surveying the devastation. The acrid smell of wet ash filled the air, and his clothes were stained with soot. But Rhoda's presence beside him was steady and warm. Her hand slipped quietly into his. We'll find a way, she said softly. God didn't bring us together just to let it end like this. Luke squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her unwavering faith. The road ahead would be harder than ever, but at least he wasn't walking it alone. And perhaps she was right. Perhaps there was more courage in choosing mercy than in seeking revenge. Tom McKinnon approached, his face grave. My barn's got space, Luke. We can split your herd between my place and the Petersons until you rebuild. Neighbors help neighbors. That's the way out here. Other ranchers nodded in agreement, stepping forward with offers of assistance. Their support didn't erase the loss, but it reminded Luke of what truly mattered. Not just the land and cattle, but the bonds of community and family that held them all together. As the sun rose higher, Rhoda gathered everyone around for a prayer of thanksgiving that no lives had been lost. Her clear voice carried across the ash-strewn yard, speaking of hope and renewal even in the darkest times. Luke bowed his head, letting her words wash over him like a healing balm. The railroad men might have destroyed his barn, but they hadn't destroyed his spirit. With Rhoda's love, the children's trust, and his neighbors' support, he would find a way forward, not through violence, but through the harder, braver path of mercy. Samuel and Eliza helped. Rhoda set out coffee and biscuits for the tired neighbors who'd worked through the night. Their small acts of kindness, of carrying on in the face of loss, spoke louder than any act of revenge could have. Luke watched them, his heart heavy but no longer bitter, knowing that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in striking back, but in refusing to let hatred take root. Luke stood at the edge of his snow-covered pasture, watching his cattle grow thinner by the day. Without the winter feed stored in the burned barn, their ribs were starting to show through their thick winter coats. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frozen ground, and his breath came out in frustrated clouds. A telegram from the railroad office lay crumpled in his coat pocket. Their offer was generous, enough money to start fresh somewhere else, maybe even build a bigger ranch. The thought of giving in made him sick, but watching his herd starve wasn't any easier. The crunch of boots on snow announced Rhoda's approach. She carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, offering one to him with understanding in her eyes. You're thinking about selling, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Luke took a long sip before answering. Maybe it would be better. Before we lose everything. This land isn't just property, Luke. Rhoda's voice grew firm. Your grandfather broke this soil with his own hands. Your father built that house, log by log. Your wife planted those apple trees by the creek. She gestured toward the homestead. Their sweat and dreams are in every acre. Luke's jaw tightened. Dreams won't feed cattle, neither will giving up. Rona turned to face him fully. Your ancestors didn't surrender when drought came, or when blizzards threatened, or when times were lean. They found a way. We can too. How? Luke demanded, gesturing at the empty barn site. That feed took months to gather. Winter's already here. We start by asking neighbors for help, Rona said. Not charity. We'll trade work for feed. I can sew, cook, preserve food. The children can help with chores. She touched his arm gently. And we look harder. There must be places we haven't thought to gather feed. Luke stared at the distant mountains, considering her words. The thought of asking for help didn't sit well with his pride, but Rona's reminder of his family's legacy stirred something deeper in his heart. Uncle Luke! Samuel came running across the yard, his boots kicking up snow. I found something. In the old storage cave. The storage cave was little more than a deep natural hollow in the hillside behind the house, used by Luke's father years ago. Luke had almost forgotten it existed. They followed Samuel to the cave's entrance. Inside, pushed to the back, they discovered several old hay bales, dusty but still usable. They weren't pretty, but the cattle wouldn't care. It's not much, Luke said, but it's something. It's a start, Rona replied, squeezing his hand. God provides, if we're willing to look. That afternoon, Luke swallowed his pride and rode out to visit his closest neighbors. Tom McKinnon offered hay in exchange for help repairing his roof. The Petersons needed help with their spring planting and would trade feed for labor. Old Jim Tucker had extra grain he'd trade for Rona's preserves and mending. Meanwhile, Rona and the children combed the winter bare pastures, gathering whatever dry grass they could find beneath the snow. Eliza discovered patches of edible winter wheat growing in sheltered spots. Samuel learned to identify which plants the cattle could safely eat, even in winter. Each small victory felt like a miracle. Every bundle of saved grass, every traded bag of feed, meant hope for the herd's survival. The work was endless and exhausting, but they faced it together in the evenings. They gathered around the fireplace, tired but satisfied. Rona would don socks or men's shirts by lamplight while Luke taught Samuel to whittle. Eliza often curled up with her mother's worn Bible, practicing her reading. The warmth of their togetherness made the cold outside seem less bitter. One night, as the children slept, Luke found Rona still awake, working on a quilt she was making to trade. You were right, he said softly, sitting beside her. About not giving up. About remembering what this land means. Rona's needle paused. Your grandfather knew what he was doing when he chose this place. The soil's good, the water's clean, and the grazing land is rich. That's worth fighting for. Luke nodded, watching the firelight play across her features. When Sarah died, I thought I'd lost everything worth fighting for. But having you and the children here, double quotes. He trailed off, emotion making his voice rough. God doesn't promise an easy path, Rona said gently. But he does promise to walk beside us. And sometimes, he sends help in ways we don't expect. The next morning brought another challenge. One of the pregnant cows was struggling, too weak from poor nutrition. Luke and Samuel spent hours with her while Rona brought them hot coffee and encouragement. By midday, with their help, the cow delivered a healthy calf, a sign of life and renewal that brought tears to Rona's eyes. Days turned into weeks of constant work. They developed a rhythm. Luke and Samuel would ride out at dawn to check the herd and gather what feed they could find. Rona and Eliza kept the house running, cooking, cleaning, and working on items to trade. Everyone learned to waste nothing, to find uses for things that might have been discarded before. The cattle grew leaner but held on. Every evening, Luke would count the herd, grateful to find them all still standing. The spring grass was still months away, but somehow, through their combined efforts and the help of neighbors, they were making it work. One evening, as they sat around the supper table, Samuel asked, "Are we poor now, Uncle Luke?" Luke looked around at their simple meal, at the patched clothes they wore, at the careful way they made everything last. Then he looked at the faces of his newfound family, at Samuel's curious expression, Eliza's gentle smile, and Rona's steady gaze. "No, son," he answered finally. "We're rich in the things that matter most." Rona reached across the table and took his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The railroad's money might have bought them an easier life somewhere else, but it couldn't have bought this sense of belonging, of fighting together for something worthwhile, of keeping faith with the land and the memories it held. As they bowed their heads for the evening prayer, Luke felt a deep certainty settle in his heart. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, drawing strength from each other and from the legacy of those who had worked this land before them. The railroad hadn't counted on the power of that kind of determination, the kind that grew stronger with each small victory, each shared burden, each moment of grace in the midst of struggle. Luke sat at his kitchen table, staring at a worn letter that had arrived that morning. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he read it again. "What is it?" Rona asked, pausing in her bread-making. "Word from Running Deer Settlement?" Luke said quietly. "About Henry, my father's old friend. He's got something that might help us with the railroad." Rona wiped flour from her hands. "The Apache elder you mentioned before?" Luke nodded. "Pa and Henry went way back. Henry knows every treaty and land agreement ever made in these parts. The letter says he's got records that could prove the railroad has no legal right to cross certain lands." Hope flickered in Rona's eyes. "That could change everything. We'd need to ride to the reservation agency," Luke said. "It's 2 days' journey." He glanced at her uncertainly. "The children could stay with the PETERSEN. "I'm coming with you," Rona said firmly. "The children will be fine with Sarah Peterson." The next morning, they set out early. 2 horses moved steadily across the winter landscape, their riders wrapped against the cold. Luke led them along trails he hadn't traveled in years, each mile bringing back memories of riding these same paths with his father. By afternoon of the second day, they approached the reservation agency. The American flag snapped in the wind above the wooden buildings. Armed soldiers paced the perimeter, their rifles glinting in the winter sun. "Stay close," Luke murmured as they dismounted. Inside the agency office, a clerk peered at them over wire-rimmed glasses. "State your business. We're here to see Henry," Luke said. "He's expecting us." The clerk's lips thinned. "All visits must be approved through proper channels. There are forms to fill out, procedures to follow. Tell him Luke Harlow is here," Luke interrupted. Son of James Harlow. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited. Finally, an older Apache man appeared in the doorway. His face was deeply lined, his black hair streaked with gray, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "Young Luke," Henry said, his voice warm. "You have your father's bearing." His gaze shifted to Rona, including her with a respectful nod. They followed Henry to his home, a simple cabin on the edge of the settlement. Inside, his wife Martha offered them tea in tin cups while Henry brought out a leather portfolio filled with yellowed papers. "Your father helped me preserve these," Henry explained, carefully spreading documents across the table. Treaties, agreements, maps marked with the old boundaries. His finger traced lines on a faded map. The railroad's planned route crosses land that was protected by the Treaty of 1862. They cannot legally build there without proper negotiations. Rona leaned forward, studying the documents. "Will the courts honor these treaties?" "They must," Henry said firmly. "These bear the government's own seal. Even corrupt judges cannot ignore them completely. While Luke and Henry discuss strategy, Rona helped Martha prepare an evening meal. The two women worked together in comfortable silence, but Rona's heart ached seeing the careful way Martha stretched their meager supplies. "It is not easy here," Martha said quietly, noting Rona's observation. "But we maintain our dignity. We remember who we are." After supper, Henry shared stories of Luke's father, of shared hunts, of hands clasped in friendship, of promises kept between good men. "James Harlow understood honor," Henry said. "He taught you well, Luke." Night fell, and Henry insisted they camp near the agency rather than risk traveling in darkness. As they settled into their bedrolls under the stars, Rona's soft voice rose in prayer. "Lord, guide us toward justice. Let truth prevail over greed. Protect those who stand for what's right." Luke listened, his heart full. Here was hope, not through violence or surrender, but through truth preserved by friendship and honor. Henry's knowledge might be the key to saving not just his ranch, but the rights of all who called this land home. The winter wind whispered through bare branches, carrying their prayers into the vast Colorado night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they rested in the knowledge that they were not alone in their fight. Luke strode into the marshal's office the next morning, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Rona followed close behind, her spine straight despite the winter chill. Henry's carefully preserved documents lay protected in Luke's leather satchel. "These treaty records prove the railroad has no right to that land," Luke declared, spreading the yellowed papers across the marshal's desk. The marshal barely glanced at them, his jowls quivering as he sneered. "Indian papers? Might as well show me chicken scratch." He pushed them away with the back of his hand. Through the open door, several townspeople had gathered on the boardwalk, drawn by the commotion. Their whispers grew as they caught glimpses of the official government seals on the treaties. "Those look real enough," Mrs. Peterson murmured to the blacksmith. "Just like them papers the railroad showed," added Tom Wheeler, the livery owner. "Except these ain't fresh ink." Rona stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "We're not asking for charity or special treatment. Only for truth to be heard." She lifted her chin, meeting the marshal's cold stare. "These treaties bear witness to promises made. How can we call ourselves God-fearing folk if we turn blind eyes to lies?" The gathered crowd grew quiet, seeing not the desperate widow from weeks ago, but a woman standing tall for justice. Even the marshal shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That evening, as the sun painted the snow-covered fields in amber light, wagons began arriving at the Harlow Ranch. Tom Wheeler brought a load of hay from his barn's extra stores. The Peterson family arrived with tools for repairing the burned barn. More neighbors followed, each bringing what they could spare. "We got a thinking," Tom said, clapping Luke's shoulder. "Ain't right what's happening here." Luke watched in amazement as his yard, filled with neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years. His gaze found Rona, who was accepting a basket of preserved goods from Mrs. Peterson with tears in her eyes. "Your lady there reminded us what matters," Tom continued. "Sometimes it takes a fresh voice to wake folks up." Luke nodded, his heart full. Rona's faith had done what his anger couldn't. It had reminded their neighbors that community meant standing together against injustice. The railroad men came at dawn, their horses' hooves crunching through crusted snow. Luke stood on his porch, shotgun steady but pointed down. Rona's presence beside him was like an anchor of calm. "Clear out, Harlow," the lead man growled. "Moss says this ends today." Luke's finger rested near the trigger, but he remembered Rona's words about mercy. The hired guns shifted uneasily as Rona clutched her wedding ring and began to pray, her voice carrying clear across the yard. "Lord, shield us from violence. Guide these men to see your truth. ... double quotes. The lead gunman's horse danced nervously. One by one, the men turned away. Unable to face such steady faith. In town, whispers grew about the railroad's forged papers. Pastor Jennings' Sunday sermon thundered against greed and lies, giving voice to what many had feared to say. The marshal's swagger dimmed as more folks spoke out. As February's harsh grip began to loosen, the first hint of spring thaw brought more than just warming air. It carried the scent of justice and renewal. The March sunshine warmed the bustling ranch yard as neighbors gathered for the barn raising. Hammers rang against fresh-cut timber, while sawdust scattered on melting snow. Women spread quilts laden with steaming stews and fresh bread, their chatter mixing with children's laughter. Rona moved among them all, her smile bright as she carried water to thirsty workers and joined the quilting circle. Her voice lifted in hymns that carried across the yard. Luke paused in his work, watching her guide Eliza in passing out biscuits, while Samuel proudly helped carry boards alongside the men. As dusk settled, lanterns cast a golden glow over the new barn's sturdy frame. Folks gathered for the evening meal, sharing stories and breaking bread together. Samuel and Eliza curled up against their mother, eyes heavy with content exhaustion. Luke carefully draped the patchwork quilt around their shoulders. "Rona," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't picture this place without you anymore." Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded, understanding God had led her here not just for shelter, but for love. Spring sunshine warmed the earth as Luke knelt in the soft dirt, carefully planting bright flowers along the porch steps. Their sweet fragrance mingled with fresh paint and new wood. Inside, Rona hummed as she hung crisp white curtains, transforming bare windows into a picture of home. The new barn stood proud against the blue sky, its timbers strong and true. Cattle grazed peacefully in the lush pastures beyond, their bells tinkling in the breeze. From the old oak tree came peals of laughter as Samuel and Eliza swung from the sturdy branch Luke had rigged for them, their joy echoing across the valley. Rona's golden wedding ring caught the evening light as she set out supper plates. She touched it gently, grateful for the path that had led her here, not as a desperate widow, but as a woman blessed twice by love. As lamplight cast its warm glow over the table, the family joined hands. Luke's deep voice led them in prayer, thanking God for justice restored, for shelter found, and for the gift of each other. The once silent house now rang with the sounds of belonging chairs scraping, children giggling, and hearts beating as one. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.